Good.
Ready? This is the Canadian Don Quixote, the biography of Major John Richardson, Canada's first novelist. And I wrote that because I felt that at the time Canada should have a literary tradition, and no one knew anything about this man. It took me 10 years to find out about him, and he turned out to be a wonderful writer, and probably our most colorful writer at that. And I'll just go through a little bit of his life. The picture on the front of the cover is of a duel in Hyde Park in 1815, and actually Richardson had fought a duel in Hyde Park in 1815 with a fellow officer who had disparaged the acting of Madame Vestry, a young actress at the time, very beautiful, and Richardson felt that merited a duel, particularly as a friend of his had made Vestry his mistress, and he felt it was a slur on his friend. That's a George Cruikshank drawing, by the way. There is a picture of him much later in his life when he was in Montreal. He was editor of a Montreal newspaper, 1848. And you see the medals here. Those medals are from Spain. He was a military man and was in the Carlist War in Spain. Here is where he began. Now, this is Queenston. Now, I had mentioned Robert Hamilton earlier. Here is his house. It was a sketch made by Lady Simcoe. It's in the center of the picture there. And that's where Richardson was supposed to have born. There's a plaque to that regard in Queenston. However, his aunt, Catherine Hamilton, after St. Catherine's is named after her. You'll notice that it's spelled with Catharine with an A. That's the Indian spelling. She was half Indian. She was dying of tuberculosis the time Richardson was born, and died 2 months after. So I doubt very much if her younger sister had gave birth in her house. His father was a surgeon with the Queen's Rangers, and they were stationed in Fort George, and I imagine that's where Richardson was born. At any rate, he grew up in Amherstburg, where John Askin was, the great fur trader. And there's a picture of Amherstburg, and the town is on the right, and it's from Elliott's Point, and on the left is Bois Blanc Island, called Boblo nowadays. And that island, by the way, was for generations in the possession of the McKee family. McKee Rankin, about whom I wrote a biography, our greatest actor, he inherited that island, and used to have his actor friends from New York, and they're up there in the summers. They had great parties. There is Tecumseh. Now, Richardson was a boy soldier in the War of 1812, and Tecumseh was very fond of him. And he wrote a great poem about Tecumseh. He was in the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed, and he was taken prisoner and taken to Kentucky. And I put out a book called The Canadian Campaign, which is a reprint of his article, which was published in London in 1826-27. It's the narration of the battles and the experiences that he had at that time in the War of 1812. Very important for the commemoration of the war that's coming up these days. There's a picture of the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. The close battle, the close fighting. Actually, General Proctor was terrible. He sacrificed his troops so he could get away. They could have had a much more defensible position, but he left them in the woods there, and they didn't have much protection against the Kentucky riflemen, who fought like guerrillas behind trees and so forth in the Indian fashion. There is a picture of the Barbados where he was sent eventually. He'd gone to England to fight Napoleon. By the time he got there, Waterloo had taken place, and he was put on half pay. He thought his army career was over, but fortunately John Norton, or Warren, was there, and Richardson got him to, with his prestige, to get him back in the army, and he was sent to Barbados and Grenada, which was a death trap because of all the yellow fever there. He caught yellow fever and almost died. He came back to Europe and he started writing. There's the Opera House in Paris. It's a scene in his novel, Écarté, his first novel, the first Canadian novel. It was published in 1829. It's a brilliant book. The master of romantic fiction, called at the time, and it's about gamblers. There's a scene of a gambling room. The young are dancing and the old are playing cards. Écarté, by the way, is the name of a card game. There's a picture of the Seine. Now the Englishmen, rich Englishmen, weren't allowed to gamble legally in London, so they all went to Paris. It was cheaper to live in Paris, and Richardson, on his half pay, lived there and traveled the continent a lot. They would lose all their money and drown themselves in the Seine. Richardson came back to London about 1827, and he was anxious to escape an unhappy marriage, and wanted to be taken on active service again, so he volunteered for the Horse Guards and got to know many of the well-known generals of the period, and eventually was able to get a captain's commission in the British Auxiliary Legion, which was sent to Spain to fight in the Carlist War on behalf of the Queen Christina. That was quite an experience for him. Here's a picture of Wacusta. In the meantime, he'd written this novel, which was about the siege of Pontiac and Fort Detroit, and he made John Norton, or Chief Warren, the major figure, and he was given the name Wacusta, the war chief. And here is some pictures of the San Sebastian in Spain, where he fought a great battle with the Carlists, where the British Legion did, and won, I think. And here is another scene of Victoria. They marched in a circular route, the whole army, overland through the mountains to Victoria inland to meet with the Spanish army. And they did that circuitous route to avoid fighting the Carlist guerrillas. Richardson was on that trek and wrote a journal about it, and I, in the modern day, traveled it by automobile and wrote a little essay, which I have included in the Canadian campaign. This compares 1835 to the present day, what I encountered. It'd be surprising how similar it was in some instances. Charles Richardson was Richardson's youngest brother. He was articled to John Beverley Robinson, and therefore became quite quite right-wing and quite conservative. And he was writing to his brother, "Come on back to Canada and start a newspaper, a Tory newspaper, so we can battle back the reformers, particularly William Lyon Mackenzie." And this young man, when he was 21, with others, dumped Mackenzie's press into the Lake Ontario, which made Mackenzie rather famous, and promoted his press unwittingly. Lord Durham came out after the rebellion to try to establish peace, and he initiated reforms. Well, John Richardson did come back to Canada as a correspondent for the London Times. Now, the London Times was a Tory newspaper, and they were not in favor of Durham. But Richardson became enamored of Durham and developed and wrote about his policies and great favoritism. So he was fired from the Times and had to make his way. And he made his way through journalism. But these men were his opponents. The man on the left there, Hincks, became the Prime Minister of Canada later on. But he was a reformer, a radical reformer, and was a great enemy of Richardson and the newspaper press. And this fellow this Derbyshire, Stuart Derbyshire, had been a friend of Richardson. He'd known him in Spain. They were journalists together in London. But he sort of threw his lot in with the reformers. And because the reformers were really in power then, he got the appointment to Queen's Printer, which Richardson so much badly wanted.